Fantastic to see you all. Thank you for giving all your time and everything. So I work at the university. I work on environmental policy. I've done that almost all my life. And I also chair something called the Leeds Climate Commission, which is like an independent body which tries to help the city to know what to do about climate change, I suppose. So as part of that, we wrote something earlier this year called the Carbon Roadmap for Leeds, which was a kind of review of everything that we thought the city could do to deliver lower carbon emissions as a city. And also a kind of attempt to say what targets should the city have to achieve in terms of lower carbon emissions through to 2050. So if we look backwards a bit to get some context, pretty much Leeds carbon emissions have halved since 1990. It's a little bit less, it's 48 or 49% or something. That's kind of happened by accident to a large degree. So some of that is because our economy has become less reliant on big industry. Some of it has happened because houses and cars have gradually got a bit more efficient and less, polluting or less leaky. And a lot of it has happened because our electricity that we consume in the city has switched from higher carbon to lower carbon sources. The biggest bit of that is because pretty much in the last 15 years, the coal-powered stations have kind of closed or have faded out and been replaced by wind energy. And that's a massive kind of new investment in new power. Kind of needed to happen because the coal power stations were largely built in the 50s and 60s. So they were kind of at the end of their life anyway, and we needed to do something to replace them. And the policy said, okay, go for wind energy instead of coal. So there have been some things which have happened deliberately. There have been some houses that have been kind of upgraded, and some transport systems have been made a bit better. But I think most of that's happened pretty much by accident rather than design. If we look forward another 30 years, then we have to get to net zero by 2050, meaning overall we have to have zero carbon emissions. So some things could still emit something, like maybe some flying, maybe some heavy industry, but if we emit anything, we have to more than compensate for that by sucking carbon out of the atmosphere by planting trees or through new technologies which could remove carbon from the atmosphere in different ways. So that's a massive challenge, and it's not entirely clear. No one really knows how we're going to do that. But what we did in the Carbon Roadmap was to say, and that we've been doing this for some years across the city. We started in 2011, and we've held loads of events where we've said, okay, what are all the things you can think of that we could adopt in the city to reduce our carbon emissions? And having worked in this area for a while, you start to think, okay, I think we've probably heard most of the ideas. But we held an event last year and people came out with new things, and you're still getting new ideas about other things we could include in the map. And that's really exciting because it shows that we haven't exhausted it all yet, and obviously no one ever knows anything, and there's new things coming through. Before that, we said, okay, in this stuff we did earlier in the year, what should the carbon targets be? And what we did was to say, in the global science, which I think you heard about last week a bit. So do you hear about IPCC? Sorry, it's my first acronym. The big intergovernmental panel on climate change. All the scientists get together and say, what does the science tell us? And what they said is there's a limit to how much globally we can emit to give ourselves a good chance of staying within the 1.5 degree limit that you heard about with Greta's video. And they set a maximum target for the total amount of emissions, and it's gigatons or squigatons or whatever it is, huge amount. And what we did was to say that's the global limit. If we divide that up by the number of people and then say that Leeds has to do its bit, but depending on its population, what is the emissions limit for Leeds? And then we just said, okay, now let's imagine we get from where we are now to where we need to be in a steady kind of gradual way through to 2050. And what the target said is that we need, as a city, need to get to 85% reduction in our carbon emissions by 2030. So we're currently on, like I said earlier, 40-something%. So we've done some of it, but we've got the next chunk to do, and probably we think the next chunk is much more difficult. So the easy stuff has kind of happened largely, and the next chunk is going to get more challenging. So the big challenge is, what do we do in the next 10 years to get to that target? And then we said, okay, let's think about everything we know about and everything people have told us about to get there. What do we do in our houses? How can we insulate our houses? How can we replace the windows, the doors, fit loft insulation? How do we fit better boilers? How do we do everything like that? Maybe put solar panels on some roofs, those kind of things. So that's all for housing. And then we thought, what about other buildings like, the council's offices or buildings like this one? How do we get these so much better that they'll deliver their part? And it's kind of the same. It's efficient lighting and it's better windows and all that kind of stuff. No rocket science-y kind of major breakthroughs, all things which are mostly pretty familiar. And then we said, okay, transport. What do we do in transport? What are all the things we can think of in transport? And that involves more efficient cars or more electric vehicles or better buses. It also involves more walking and cycling and more use of public transport. And also it involves maybe people living less far away from their work or their leisure places. So, if there's a housing development, not far away from here, where people won't need cars, they hope, because they can walk into the city and they can walk to work, and that reduces their demand for travel. Then we thought about all the things that happened in industry or could happen in industry. So earlier this afternoon, one of the big employers in the city is a glass maker. They make glass bottles and jars and stuff like that. They use a lot of energy because they need to melt the glass. How can industries like that use less gas or, use less glass to make a bottle? So they have to heat less glass to melt it, that kind of stuff. And then the last bit we looked at was waste. How much waste from our landfill sites or from the incinerator over there can we reduce the waste so we emit less from our waste sectors? And what it found broadly, and there was a line that came from it, which is to meet the target, you can choose any of those options you like as long as you choose all of them, because we need to do everything we can think of in order to meet that target by 2030 and even more by 2050. So that means there is no silver bullet. There's no big, technological breakthrough that can deliver all of this. We need to change all our housing, all our transport, all our waste, all our industry, and all of that. The good news is that half of it, the first half, we reckon is probably economically beneficial. So we would have to invest as a city £1 billion, huge amount of money, but that £1 billion would pay for itself through all the energy saving within maybe 4 years. And it would also create, we think, about 4,000, it's not jobs, 4,000 years of employment. So it's 400 people employed for 10 years. So in theory, we should be able to raise that money because it should be profitable to do that first half. But then after that, at the moment, the costs start to rise. So the second chunk is doable with existing technologies, don't need any big breakthroughs to do it, but it's expensive. So things like public transport, think about, Leeds having a tram system. That would reduce carbon emissions quite a lot if it was designed in the right way and all of that kind of stuff, but it would be massively expensive. And then the last chunk is what we called them in the report stretch options. These are kind of slightly bonkers things that nobody's really thought of yet that could happen. They're things like, so instead of the city using tons of concrete and steel in new buildings like this, imagine that these buildings were made out of wood, and we reduced our concrete and steel consumption. And imagine if instead of building huge flood defences and pouring, loads and loads of concrete, which is really carbon intensive, instead of that we had woodland which soaked up the forest instead. Soaked up the floods instead. And we looked at other things like reducing food waste or consuming less generally, consuming less meat and dairy, not all becoming vegetarian by any means, but for example, eating meat twice a week instead of 4 times a week or whatever. And we added it all up, and the good thing was that it gets us to the target. So there's one way of doing it, and part of the reason for having the jury is to say there are lots of other ways we could do it, and as well as what we do, is also important to think about the way that we do it. So who pays for it is a big question. Should it be all of us? At the moment we're working on the airport and airport expansion, and it turns out that 1% of the population make 20% of the flights, and half the population doesn't fly at all, or rarely flies in the last year. So the carbon impact isn't spread equally across all of us. Some of us have a much bigger carbon footprint than others. And so in the airport's case, imagine if we had like a tax on anybody that flew more than 3 or 4 times a year. So those frequent flyers cause the problem, and they should pay into a fund, which then goes into tree planting or goes into, insulating people's lofts or changing people's behaviour in some way. So
you said we're working on the airport expansion. Do you want to explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so the Climate Commission, this airport expansion is a massively sensitive issue. There's a pretty big row brewing between people who think we can't declare a climate emergency 1 month and then 6 months later expand the airport. It's just bonkers to do it that way. The other argument is our economy and our society depends on flying, and people want to go on holidays, and therefore we need to find a way of reducing the impact of flights, but we shouldn't ban them or stop them entirely. So
you say you're working on it, you mean you're researching?
So the Climate Commission is there to kind of put independent evidence into the debate, and in 2 weeks' time we'll be publishing a short paper saying this is the significance of what happens if you double the size of the airport, which is the proposal broadly, and these are the things we think you could do about it. So it's us saying, here's what we think is the way forward on this kind of stuff. Yeah. So the plan is for it to go from about 4 million passengers a year to 7 million passengers a year by 2030, and then to 9 million by 2050. So, yeah, it's important economically, absolutely, but it makes reaching that climate target much, much more challenging. So part of it is how we pay for it, and there are different ways that we could think about paying for it. Imagine if, residents of Leeds apparently have got £2 billion in their savings accounts. It's a staggering amount of money. And I would imagine most people don't know where that money goes. It could go off to China or wherever. And imagine if instead we had a local fund, a not-for-profit fund, and people invested in the city, and they could go and see the job they helped create and swim in the swimming pool that they helped to heat. And they could also get a return on their savings, a bit like in a building society. So that is a real possibility. That could well happen in the near future. There's a proposal to allow local residents to invest in putting solar panels on swimming pool roofs. And if that could scale up and we could get all of those people to invest some of their money in a low carbon fund for Leeds, it would all come back home, all the benefit would stay in the city, and it would be more equal and more fair. There's other ways of doing it as well. There's money to be made in low carbon, undoubtedly, on some bits of it. The council could tax us more. We could self-fund it. You could choose, maybe to insulate your loft or to turn your thermostat down, or all the things that could be done. But there's a key question about, how do we pay for it and how fair can we make it? And the last aspect of that, going back to the glass company, is that there may be some sectors economically or places of the city that are at risk from this. People think, I work in the glass factory, this is just going to cost me my job, or I need my car to get to work, when there's no buses, and you're going to make my life more difficult. So the last bit of the jigsaw puzzle is to say, how do we make it fair and equitable, and make sure that the gains from all of this maybe are channeled towards the poorer areas or the high carbon areas that would suffer the most. And one example of that, a while ago the Body Shop makes cosmetics. They were thinking, we want to build a new shampoo factory. Where do we put it in the whole of the UK? And they said, let's put it in the East End of Glasgow, because that's the area that needs the jobs most. And that aspect is coming through on this carbon transition as well. So how do we take the good bits and put them in the areas that are at risk of suffering from the bad bits, so that it's a fair process? And that's about it.
My name's Paul Chatterton. I think I'm the Blue Peter version of Andy because I brought some props with me. So it's a bit more of an interactive version. I'm constantly trying to find ways to communicate to big audiences about complicated issues. So I'm trying some stuff out. So thanks very much for giving me this opportunity to come and talk to you with Andy. I've been helping to bring this climate jury together. So it's a real privilege to kind of like engage with you here down tonight. So I'm a geographer. I work in geography at the University of Leeds. You'll remember geography, you either loved or hated it at school, right? So it's one of those things that kind of like, we want to understand the world. And I'm an urban geographer, so I'm into cities, how cities are changing. At the university, I'm a professor of urban futures, so I'm kind of interested in how cities unfold in the future. So I've lived in Leeds all my life. I've lived in Beeston, I've lived in Swarcliffe, I've lived in Rawdon, so I know different parts of the city, so I know it fairly well. So I'm very interested in what the future of Leeds is like. I've done all sorts of things in the city. I live in a straw house in Bramley. We set up a housing co-op, so there's 20 houses. So I've done things like that. I've helped set up a big neighbourhood to building other houses, which I'll talk about in a bit. And I've helped set up this group called Our Future Leeds, which is trying to generate ideas for the future of Leeds. But what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is talk to you a little bit more, picking up some of the threads that Andy talked to you about. And it's really about this stuff. So I've got this the right way up. Yeah, brilliant. Now, hopefully everyone can see this, and apologies if it's not the right way up for you. I can keep spinning it around. The Leeds Carbon Challenge. Yeah, I'm going to try and graphically represent some of the things that Andy said, because there's a nice complexity here, but there's an important story behind it. Yeah. So, do you remember first off the thing that Andy mentioned about this carbon budget? 42 million tonnes of carbon. You can imagine it out in the car park. It would be a massive cube of carbon dioxide of gas. That is the budget which we, as a city of Leeds, has got. And the reason it's important, because remember Kat and Julie last week talked about if we use more than our budget, we have a higher probability of exceeding that 1.5 degree of global warming, and Kat and Julie told you the consequences of that. So we've got to stick to this budget. The other issue is, think about your own household economy. If we exceed this budget, we're eating into somebody else's budget. And if everybody extends their budget, say in Manchester and Birmingham and Alabama, then we're all going to exceed the global budget that Andy talked about, and we'll overshoot that 1.5 degree quite considerably. So this is really important, right? 42 million tonnes. And we've been given that allocation because what Andy said is it's a proportion of Leeds population compared to the global population, right? Let's have a look at it on a map, on a graph. So this is the graph I want to present you with. Down this side are tonnes of carbon, right? Along this side is time. Can everyone see it all right? I'll keep swizzing it around a bit, yeah? Now, we as a city use 4 million tonnes of carbon a year, right? So at the present rate, if we put this on like this, there it is. 4 million tonnes a year, 2018, 4 million tonnes, 2019, 4 million tonnes, 2020, 4 million tonnes. Quick bit of maths, we'll burn that up, our budget, at the current rate, in 10 years. It is going down a little bit, but it's fairly flat. So here's the issue. By 2028, if we just keep at this rate of use, we get to the edge of a cliff in 2028 and we go straight off the edge of a cliff. So obviously we don't want to do that. That's the whole point of what Andy's been doing and saying there's a roadmap to zero. So we need to do this. We need to get on a curve as a city and gently, rapidly descend towards zero as quickly as possible. So rather than just ticking along as we are, we need to start reducing year on year the amount of carbon we use. So by, I don't know, 2030s, 2040s, people disagree about the end date, but it's, in about 20 years, we're about zero carbon as a city, away from that 4 million tonnes, yeah? So that's the curve we need to get on. So it's a challenge. Now here's the thing, therefore, this is the bit we can't use, right? So what I've done is, look, that and that's 42 million tonnes. That's if we keep using it at the rate, and that's still 42 million tonnes, but we've squidged it, we've spread it over about 20 odd years, yeah? To make it tolerable decline year on year, a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less. Yeah? You can imagine if you're running a household, a household purse, you have to reduce spending. It's the kind of same principle, yeah? And so this is the bit we can't use. There's all sorts of activities in here, yeah, that we can't use. Cars, aeroplanes, shopping, all sorts of things we're going to talk about in a bit. So that's a really important bit. Now there's one extra dimension I want to, and we can follow all these in questions, because I appreciate it's kind of a lot of numbers and things. There's one extra dimension I want to add to this, because 4 million tonnes here, that's not really what we use as a city, because it only counts certain things. It only counts the carbon we use within the city boundaries. It's a bit more complicated than that, but we haven't got a huge amount of time. But the way I'm going to present it to you is 4 million tonnes is kind of what the government expects us to count. But we've got some other things to add in. Almost everything we rely on in our daily lives, food, clothes, watches, you name it, services, goods, come from somewhere else, probably those biscuits, outside Leeds. Not much is made in Leeds anymore, yeah? We're not the workshop of the world we used to be. So all that stuff comes into Leeds, and there's also flying, which doesn't get counted. So if you add flying and shopping and food, which all those things that come into Leeds, we actually use more like 11 million tonnes a year. It's almost double, right? So that's the starting point that the City Council is using, this curve. But actually, if you add all the other stuff, which we depend upon for our daily lives, all this came from somewhere else, yeah? And it used carbon to make it, and it all came into the city. All that stuff got imported into the city from somewhere else, from Bangladesh, from Turkey, from India, from Wales, wherever it came from. So we should put it on our balance sheet because we're using it, we're benefiting it as consumers. Look what happens to the curve. It's still got to be 42 million tonnes, so we can't change the budget. We've got to squidge it even further. So look what happens to it. Look at that curve. Look at the descent curve now. Look how rapidly we've got to change now. Yeah? But all this is doable, because what we've got to understand is the challenge and exactly how we can respond, because I'm going to go on to that now. That is the scale of the task. But we need to know the scale of the task because we need to respond to it properly. This detox challenge, I call it the Leeds Detox Challenge, the Leeds Carbon Detox Challenge. What have we got to stop doing? Yeah, and for me, there's the big four. Where's the carbon in the city? And Andy's talked a lot about where it is. There's some big blobs of carbon out there. One of the big ones, almost half, well, certainly that 4 million tonnes, is road transport. We've got this massive motorway system which goes through the south of Leeds. We all know about it, yeah? And the huge A roads. Leeds is massive. Goes all the way to Otley, all the way to Wetherby, all the way to Morley, right? Motorway city of the 70s. So there's a huge amount of car transport going on in the city. So there's a huge amount of emissions locked up in motorways, in A roads, going around the city. Car-based travel. It's just the facts of where it is. Leaky homes. We've got so many leaky homes in this city, back-to-backs. And that's where loads of emissions are tied up, almost a million tonnes. And then this aviation thing, this really sticking point, because while it's not that big at the moment, as Andy said, there's no plan for it decreasing. We've got clever people all over the city talking about how we can reduce emissions from this lot, but no one's talking about reducing from this lot. All we're talking about is growth. So while all this lot might go down, aviation's going the other way. Yeah? So that's why aviation is a big problem. And then stuff. Bags of shopping. John Lewis, H&M, Argos. It's all from somewhere else. And we all love it because it makes Leeds great and it makes us have a really great life. But it all comes from somewhere else. And it's a massive source of carbon emissions and they're all ours. Yeah? So that's the challenge. So I want to present to you now in a couple of minutes left, 5 minutes left. I want to present to you now, 6 minutes left. Hey, 4 minutes, yeah. A vision for Leeds 2040, right? Because I've got kids in this city. I've got friendship networks in this city. I'm not going anywhere. In 2040, in this city, I want to have a wonderful life with you all, right? So what is Leeds 2040 for me? It's a very different place. There's 6 There's 6 different aspects to it, and they all directly address the big 4 carbon baddies, right? Because on the other side of this, there's a brilliant Leeds, right? And of course we can do this, and Greta Thunberg eloquently says we can do this as well. So there's 6 areas to it. First one is transport. We know it's all looked up in motorways and roads and high carbon transport at the moment, but we need to get the city back on track to have an absolutely free and zero carbon transport system that's good, free, accessible and safe. Free public, for example, entirely free public bus system in the city. Yeah, start to purchase, the big bus companies that have come up for sale. A whole network of cycling infrastructure. Reduced air traffic at the airport, certainly. Really great pedestrian extended areas in neighbourhoods. And when public transport is better and cheaper, people just use their cars less, right? So we have to have this vision of a free, cheap, affordable and safe public transport system. And then we will naturally just have those great alternatives. We won't have to depend on the car, right? So it's not about being anti-car, it's been about pro-choice and pro-free choice, right? Free, accessible, clean choice. Second one, these homes, right? We need to have a vision about decent, zero-carbon, warm and affordable homes. We need to have an army of insulators who go out street by street and do this. And we have to find the funding to do it, as Andy said. Yeah? And we can think about how we can do that because there's 20 billion pounds set in bank accounts that we can recycle. I set up Leeds Community Homes. We did a share offer. We raised £364,000 in 6 weeks amongst the people of Leeds, and we used that to buy 60 low-carbon homes in the South Bank. And that was just a bunch of us who came up with an idea. So if we did that at a city scale, we'd get millions and we'd transform the city, get Leeds College a building on site. The third one is the places in Leeds. They all need repurposing, changing. So we don't travel around so much in our cars or go on foreign holidays, but the places in Leeds are wonderful. So we've got wonderful green spaces, we've got sports ground and playgrounds and public art galleries. So we stay here more because there's great stuff to do in the city. And then the food one, we need a big push for a food economy because that's where a lot of external food carbon miles are coming into the city. So we need massive city farms where we grow food within the city boundaries. The fifth one is kind of participation, a bit like this. So we need to get citizens involved because they know the best solutions. And in their neighbourhoods, they can start to generate their own wealth, stop the wealth going out of those neighbourhoods and use that wealth to create socially just, climate-proof solutions right in their neighbourhoods where they live, right? And people are doing this right now. It's about unlocking that potential in neighbourhoods because that's where the action is going to happen. And then the final one, the sixth one, is this new local economy. So we've got an army of tinkerers and traders and makers who will make all the stuff that we have, that we need, that will meet our wants, and we'll have a resurgence of neighbourhood markets. So they will meet our needs, and we won't have to rely on all these external goods, right? And we'll have that great old style kind of local economy where we'll meet our needs within the city boundaries. So that's my vision for 6 points for our future Leeds 2040. It's all entirely doable. There's some fancy footwork to get there, but we've totally got the assets and resources in the city to do it. So thank you very much. There's some, to keep in touch, there's some details there. I'll leave them out just so you know who I am and how you can get in touch with me. Because what I'm going to do, by the way, a lot of things I've said is you're all going to get a copy at the end tonight. I'm going to leave them out. I've written a book about all this and a little kind of brief version of it. So these are going to be like, you can all take a copy of these home. And there's stuff on the web about what it all is. So that's for you to take home and ponder on. So thank you for listening. Thanks.